Hello Stanton students, this is Mr. Tovry, and we're going to be going over ancient classical era religions and belief systems from 8000 BCE to 400 CE for this lecture. We are going to cover key concepts 2.1 and 1.3. Be sure that you take a closer look at these key concepts. But we'll be covering animism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and we'll talk a little bit about their influence, their larger influence on culture at that time. So what you want to be able to do by the end of this lecture and through your readings is be able to identify the characteristics of these religions. You also want to be able to explain or describe how they evolved, how they changed over time. Be able to discuss similarities and differences with other religions and evaluate what impact they had culturally, but perhaps politically as well. Think about the themes that we talk about, the spice themes for this class. So, even though I mentioned we're covering 8000 BCE to 600 BCE, the idea or the belief in animism really goes back to as far back as 100,000 years ago. And this was the idea that everyday objects, trees, the sun, water, had spirits within them, or they were animated by these spirits. And so many of the statues or things created were done so in a way to try and create this effect that things had spirits within them. So some examples up in the top right corner, those are that's from Igbo mythology. Those are Igbo statues from modern day Nigeria that were created as a way to help grow crops, yams in particular. So that would be an example of what's called a fetish, or an object that is worshipped and believed to have special powers or magical powers. So it could be a statue, it could be a painting, it could be an amulet, like a necklace that you wear around you. And another characteristic of animism is that cultures around the world also had shamans, and still do. This is a modern day shaman, this woman in the right with the red material on her head. This is called Hmong shaman, and Hmong shamans exist in the south of China and also in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. And typically shamans use medicine to heal the sick or try to contact spirits, contact ancestors to divine the future or try and guess what's going to happen in the future. So some general characteristics about animism is that there is no founder of animism. This is something that occurs organically all over the world, and it's hard to pinpoint a clear date. A lot of this is an oral tradition. It was not written down. Remember, we won't have written records until about 4000 BCE. And this happens typically in indigenous cultures, and it's something that is still practiced today. There's many examples of shamans today, as I mentioned in the previous slide, and in religions that have the belief that everyday objects are animated by spirits. So you can think of this, of animism, and this belief as part of something that continues through time for your CCOT. So, some examples of this. On the previous slide, that was some cave paintings from the Pont d'Arc cave in France. And this was a cave that was discovered fairly recently in the 90s. And it was so well preserved because it had been sealed off for a long time. And so it's some of the oldest cave paintings, and what many historians speculate is that the people who drew those did so in some way as to think that by doing so they would be able to capture these animals or hunt these animals a little better. So that idea, the idea that just by painting something you might magically be able to make it easier to catch in real life, suggests some belief in mysterious powers. And so there are a bunch of these examples like these. There are many Venus statues that are some of the oldest statues created that depict women who are fertile, and the belief was that by creating these statues, perhaps people they know would be more fertile as well. Çatalhöyük and Jericho are some of the sites where some amulets and some of the oldest animistic objects have been found. In the top right here, this amulet is a Vondun amulet from Africa, which becomes, or you might be more familiar with Voodoo, the Caribbean religion. This is a modern day example of an animistic religion, but there's many others from Africa and Papua New Guinea, and from Native Americans in North America. In the bottom right, these are Chippewa shaman. Okay, when we talk about the Vedic religions, we're talking about Hinduism. Today, there are 755 million Hindus in India. Another way of thinking about that is that there are 2 United States of Hindus living in India now. The population of the United States times 2 of Hindus living in India. In a space about the third the size of the United States. It's one of the oldest known religions. We can date it back to about 4,000 years. And there's also no known founder for Hinduism. So that might be a good way to think about distinguishing it from some of the other larger religions like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism that do have a founder of those religions, right? So some of the main beliefs of Hinduism are karma and reincarnation. A lot of you might be familiar with this idea that instead of when one dies, that is the end of it, and your spirit goes on to another place or something like that. In Hinduism, your spirit would be reincarnated into another spirit, and this would continue to happen until something called moksha, which is some kind of idea of salvation, is attained, or it happens. And so how it's decided that you go into a different life is based on karma, on your actions in this life. Now this gives rise to the caste system because this is a system of oppression that is developed out of this idea of reincarnation and the idea that people who are in certain positions in society must have done something bad in a previous life to get put there. And so this could include jobs like sweeping the floor, or jobs like curing leather, which is not particularly great. And so it gave rise to this idea that people were stuck in the job that they did or the place that they were, and there was no movement, no social movement. And a good way to distinguish Hinduism from Western religions is that there isn't this idea of a universal struggle of good and evil. Hinduism has more of a circular belief system. Okay, and since we're making comparisons as well, unlike some other major religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism does not have one sole sacred text. It has multiple sacred texts, much like Buddhism as well. Buddhism does not have a single sacred text. It has many texts that its adherents or followers use. And so the three main ones are the Vedas, which is actually 4 texts, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Upanishads. The Vedas are the oldest of these texts, written about 1500, or composed about 1500 years ago orally, and then written around 200 CE. And the 4 Vedas are the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. The Bhagavad Gita is probably the most widely known Hindu text. This also contains the Mahabharata, which is an Indian epic about this hero Ramayana. And in this epic, this picture here to the right, this is a picture of Rama, a prince who is given these idealistic characteristics. He's supposed to be a poet and a hero, and he's represents everything good. And in this epic, which will end up in class as well, at least parts of it, he goes off to save his wife from this demon who has kidnapped her. It's compelling. And the Upanishads, these are a focus on meditation. So Hinduism is a polytheistic religion, contains many deities. We'll mention just a few of them, but certainly not all of them. And it's important to realize that these deities are not meant to be thought of as literal, meaning that they don't exist in their literal form here on Earth, even though they are, and this is a good term to know, they are anthropomorphized, which means they have human qualities or human characteristics, right? But a couple of the major 3 deities in Hinduism are Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. Brahma is thought of as the universal soul or the creator deity. He's often depicted with 4 heads and 4 arms. Shiva, even though Shiva is known as the destroyer, this shouldn't be thought of necessarily as a negative force, because there's this cycle in Hinduism, or this belief in death and rebirth. Shiva the destroyer is thought of as a necessary part of this cycle. And then Vishnu, the preserver. Vishnu is often takes many forms, what are called avatars. This is where that term avatar comes from. And so Vishnu will take the form of a fish or a turtle, boar, but also things like a warrior or a sage, which is a wise person. And then some other interesting deities. Ganesha is a deity that is familiar to many because Ganesha has the head of an elephant and represents wisdom and knowledge. Krishna, is one of the avatars of Vishnu, and Kali is one of the gods that represents time and change. Okay, so then around the same time as the beginning of Hinduism, we have the beginnings of Judaism as well. And so Judaism arises in Mesopotamia. And it's interesting to note that this small area of Israel and South and Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of these 3 major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's particular to note that there is some change from polytheism, this belief in animism or many gods, especially among the Greeks who believed in many gods and the Romans who also believed in many gods, to this idea that there is a single God that controls every part of the universe. So, Judaism is believed to have a founder, and that founder is Abraham. Abraham is tested by God, and he is known for proving his faith to God in a variety of ways, a couple ways. One of those is that it's depicted here in this painting to the right, that God asked him to kill his only son Isaac, with which he's stopped right before he does it. And that's one way that he proved his faith. Another was that he was going to leave behind his land in Mesopotamia and travel to Canaan. And so taking that on his faith is another way that he proved his faith to God. And so in return, in Judaism, it's believed that because Abraham proved his faith in these ways, he created a covenant with God, which was the special relationship where God said he would favor Abraham and his descendants. That's why in Judaism it is important to be a descendant from the family of Abraham. So this map shows, like I mentioned, Abraham proves his faith by leaving his home in Ur in Babylonia and traveling to Canaan. That's one of the ways that he proves his faith and creates this covenant. Okay, so I mentioned that because of this covenant with God, it's important for Jews that they trace this lineage of Abraham's family. And so much of the Torah, the sacred text in Judaism, is dedicated to tracing this lineage. Many might be familiar that the Torah is the Old Testament part of the Christian Bible. And so Abraham settles in Canaan. His grandson Jacob takes on the name Israel, and so this is where we get the term Israel, which literally means to wrestle with God. And so it's valued in Judaism that one struggles with their belief in God. There are eventually 12 tribes or kingdoms that are established in Israel, but eventually they come under the rule of the Pharaoh in Egypt. So many are familiar with the story of Moses, who is abandoned as a child and raised under the Pharaoh, and eventually leads an exodus against that Pharaoh, who is Ramses II, out of Egypt and into the desert where he and the Jews wander for 40 years. And another one of the patriarchs is David, who was the second king of Israel. He's believed to live about 1000 BCE and David is often depicted as someone who's both a poet and also a warrior. He takes on both of these roles, and he's known for defeating the giant Goliath. So after the Jews leave Egypt and settle in modern-day or Palestine, modern-day Israel, they have to then contend with being occupied by the Roman Empire. And the Jewish temple temples like Solomon's temple, which in this top right corner, this is a building, a sculpture, a model of Solomon's temple. But the temple was very important in Jewish life at this time, and around in the first century of Judea. This is where the priests of Judaism would control this temple and control this center part, which was called the holiest of holies. But out in this outer part, where you can see this open square part, this is where trades and a marketplace would go on, and people could purchase items for sacrifices and those things. But it was a very turbulent time, in part because Jews often believed that the priests of these temples were in cahoots with the Roman Empire, or they were backed by the Roman Empire, and that they tried to put down protests as a way to keep their own power. And so there are often riots and revolts in Jerusalem, which was a large city for that time. And finally, in 66 CE, Rome decides to destroy the city of Jerusalem, and it creates a diaspora, or a spreading of Jews to Europe and to North Africa. And you can see this mesa in the bottom right. This is called Masada, and this was the last outposts of the Jewish rebellion during the attack on Jerusalem. They fled to this kind of hilltop, mountaintop, and if you can see, there's actually like a kingdom built on top of this. And so while they tried to survive there, the Romans built a ramp, you can see on the left side, to try and attack, and finally did, and where the rest, or the remaining Jews, committed suicide as opposed to giving up to the Romans. Okay, and so that's a good place to bring us to the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's a good time to mention that both Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam occupy this characteristic of being universalizing religions. And what that means is that they're not religions that are particular to one ethnic group. So where Hinduism and Confucianism are particular of a certain ethnic group, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam spread to many different ethnic groups. So, we don't have a lot of written evidence from Jesus of Nazareth, but we know he was born in Nazareth sometime between 4 BCE and 2 CE, and we know that he was executed under the Romans in Jerusalem, essentially for the crime of treason. You might be familiar with the inscription INRI above his crucifix, and this stands for, in Latin, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he, like many others at that time, were walking around Judea at that time and challenging the authority of the Jewish temple and of the priests in the Jewish temple. And for that reason, that is why the Romans crucified him. And so if you're interested in studying the history of Christianity, it's probably better to look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible if you want to find out an idea of what first century Palestine, what that place was like. Okay, and so the beliefs in Christianity focus around a personal faith. Like I mentioned, it was thought that Jewish priests in Jerusalem that were in control of the temples thought they had a monopoly on faith, right? And they demanded that you pay for sacrifices. And so this was something that Jesus preached against. And he also is known for caring for the sick and the poor and the cleansing of sins. Christianity is spread, or it's helped to be spread by apostles like James and Paul of Tarsus. And Paul was a Roman Jew who lived north of Israel in modern-day Turkey. And it's debated about whether or not he was an apostle, but he called himself an apostle. James was an apostle who was the brother of Jesus in Jerusalem. And Paul of Tarsus is sent to Rome under the command of James. That's at one point. John the Baptist, to backtrack a little bit, is a major figure in Christianity. He is someone who it's believed Jesus met before he was crucified. And John the Baptist was a preacher who preached in kind of the outlying areas of Jerusalem. And so the Gospels that we have in Christianity are from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the earliest of those was written 30 years after the death of Jesus, but all of those tell the story of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. Okay. Christianity was able to spread in part because it was able to distance itself from the Roman Empire. And what I mean by that is that even in the story of telling Jesus as crucified under the Roman Empire, the story gives gives less responsibility to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Jerusalem, who crucifies Jesus. And so for that reason, it's able to spread throughout Rome. It remains kind of on the fringe of society in Rome for a couple hundred years, but eventually it does gain quite a few followers. And Constantine, it's debated about if he was ever baptized or how devout of a Christian Constantine actually was, but it's said that he was baptized on his deathbed. But nonetheless, he considered himself, he called himself emperor of the Christian people, and the effects of his rule are obvious. The Christian population went from 10% to half of the population of Rome, and of course this is what helped spread Christianity into the Western world. And it goes from being a religion that was persecuted in the Roman Empire, Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, to an empire that destroyed its own pagan shrines that it had previously worshipped. And probably one of the most notable things that Constantine does is he orders the First Council of Nicaea, which is a group that comes together to decide the meaning between or the relationship between Jesus and God. And so this is where the idea of the Holy Trinity in Christianity arises, that Jesus is both God and a person on earth and a Holy Spirit, all three of those things in one. So, both Hinduism, Judaism, and Christianity spread their influence in cultures of the places they were spread. Judaism, because of the diaspora, the codification or the laws that were written from Judaism go into some places, but the influence of Christianity is dominant in the Western world, especially after Rome adopts it as its official religion. And so this creates this ongoing battle for Jerusalem between Christians and Muslims after the rise of Islam, for Jerusalem. And today we can see its influence in our everyday language. Phrases like labor of love, good Samaritan, at wit's end, bite the dust, are phrases that come from the Bible. And of course we see it in art, like the architecture of Gothic churches of the medieval or the Middle Ages in the top right. But you can see the difference between how it's portrayed when we have the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western art of Western Europe. You can see the painting on the bottom right there is a painting from the Byzantine Empire. The one on the left from Raphael, a European painter. Okay, so you might be thinking, hey, we didn't go over Confucianism or Buddhism at all. Well, we're going to talk about those in our philosophy lecture and talk about what distinguishes a philosophy from a religion. So we will get to that. So something for you to think about and bring with you to class. How do you think this idea of monotheism came about? Obviously, we have this change from a polytheistic religion's belief in many gods to the belief in just one solitary God. So come with an answer of how you think monotheism came about. Also, what makes a religion appealing for society? We have religion in every culture and society, and so what is appealing about religion for people? What does it do for us? And finally, do a little bit of research on another animistic religion that I didn't mention at the beginning of the lecture, something that I didn't talk about, and bring that with you to class. Be able to talk a little bit about another animistic religion, and there's some in every part of the world, so it shouldn't be difficult for you to find.